Well, good morning to you. My name's Al Kyte, and we're in our Moraga garden, which is just over the hill east of Oakland. And today is the first in a series of short videos that we're doing on dimensions of beauty in the California native plant garden. And of course, I guess that's my concepts of beauty. But today's topic is about the dry beauty at summer's end. And of course, we went through a hot, dry, smoky summer. But the summer's end, no matter what the weather, my attention shifts away from the plants a little bit and into things around the plants. And this kind of grows out of one of my basic principles that I follow, which is an old Japanese concept of you try to keep the spatial balance between the plants in your yard, the rocks in your yard, and the water or suggestion of water you have. So, because we can't always have the water. So how do we go about that? Well, as I say, my attention shifts from the plants to these other things. Let's start with the mulch that I select. I prefer in a mulch kind of the look of a forest floor, which is many different colors, but the prevailing color tone is a dark brown. And so 50% of my material is usually a brown mulch chip. And into that I mix a black chip and kind of a reddish mulch chip, and then about half, or the rest of it is just leaves, small leaves in assorted colors, and mix that all together and put it on my plants. Now, what do I do for the pathways here? The pathways are about half pea gravel and half red lava chip, 5/16 inch. And also, the adjacent brown chip mulch creeps down and has a way of working down. So that only adds to the naturalness of the pathway. So it's a brown, more reddish brown look than pea gravel itself. How about the rocks that I place around the pathway? Well, there's two words I like to keep in mind. One is embedded and the other is intermittent. When I first started putting plants in, the prevailing wisdom was to embed the rocks about a third. And first I didn't want to embed that much because I paid money for those. I want to see those rocks. But now I've gone the other way. I embed probably on the average half of my rock. Why is that? Well, I want to see the outside of a rock. I don't want to see it curving back under. I want to see it spreading like a much bigger rock and then the land. So I embed on the average about a half. Intermittent, that means the rocks aren't lined up one after another. You see where there might naturally be a rock outcropping, and you put a few rocks there, and then a little farther down, maybe you put a few more rocks. I think you can get the feeling of what I'm talking about by the photograph I have that I want to show next. Now, the other, one of the questions I get commonly is how do you build in the suggestion of water to your garden? Well, often it's the pathway that you use. And when you consider the pathway, the first thing I think about is the slope. How much slope is there? Most of my pathways are fairly level. How does water flow through level ground? Well, it tends to meander and swing back and forth, side to side. The main current hits the outside curve and erodes the side, and then it swings back the other way. The inside of the curve is, that's where rocks that are carried in the water are deposited to the bottom, so you get more of a gravel bar. The outside of the curve, you get big blunt rocks. But you start actually with the layout of your trail. If you're naturally alternating sides as soft curves in your pathway, you'll get kind of a natural look, almost like water to begin with. And those rocks, the placement of rocks only accentuate that. So let me show you here. That's the outside of the curve. You can see the line in the pathway. It really talks about where the main current would be flowing. Almost hits those rocks and starts swinging back. The inside of the curve is where the gravel bar is, and that's where the slow water is. So anyway, that starts to give the feeling of a dry stream bed. So your pathways often are doubling as a dry stream bed. How about if you have a little bit of slope, gradual slope to your pathway? Well, you kind of feel inclined to put in a little step once in a while to kind of make it easier to walk on. But you can do that naturally by taking advantage of another characteristic of flowing water. When water's coming down a slope, all of a sudden it starts changing speed. It goes from fast to slow, alternatingly. So you find a slow pool, for example. What happens at the tail out of that pool? It shallows down, the water speeds up, goes over a few rocks, and then gushes into another pool, slows down, goes through, and then speeds up again. So if you kind of, in your pathway, put in some natural areas like a tail out of pools once in a while, you can create that effect. And the next photograph kind of shows my rendition of that in one of my pathways. How about if you have a steep slope in your garden? Well, a lot of you have steep slopes. This is where you no longer have your pathway suggesting water, because it just doesn't work that way. What I want in a pathway on a steep slope is kind of a series of switchbacks, as if I'm going up a mountain pass. It gives me longer time to be in the slope, enjoying the plants, and an easier walk. But the water doesn't come down that way. The water gushes down, it pours down, it creates V-shaped channels and cuts into the bottom. So it cuts across your trails. In fact, some people that have water gardens creatively use that as a falls for their water garden, and as you go back and forth, you're constantly crossing running water, which is a beautiful effect. What other effects can I have with a stream bed, suggestion of water? Well, some of you might have dry, desert-like water and desert plants. Well, you might try to create an effect of an arroyo. And arroyo is a little different because it's a little more trench-like. The water flow is created by a sudden gushing of water, as from a flash flood. And so you get kind of steep banks and then flat bottom with very small particles like sand being carried along. And so here's my version of an arroyo in my yard. Sometimes I like a pathway a suggestion of stream that crosses my pathway and disappears invitingly into the foliage. And here's a photograph of that going into some manzanita. I don't want to give the impression that we just use rocks to suggest water. And I'll give you 3 other quick uses out of many that you might have. One is what I call a specimen rock. We talk about specimen plants. Why not specimen rocks? Your largest rocks. So the next photograph is of a 500-pound rock that I have with some epilobium around it at summer's end. And earlier in the summer, I have different plants that will be blooming around it. So that's one effect. The second effect is a rock garden. Here you have a rock outcropping, and where you have little chips of the rock that presumably have fallen off to the ground, forming a different type of mulch. Instead of fir bark, it's a crushed rock mulch. And you put plants in that really want that environment, such as the Lewisii pictured in the next photograph. The last use of rocks I want to talk about today is the remnant wall. I first ran across remnant walls when I was at Botanic Garden down in Flagstaff, Arizona. I love to visit botanic gardens. And I was looking at these plants, and all of a sudden I saw what looked like a part of a building out of the past. And I thought, gee, that looks like an old adobe. I wonder what the history of that is. Well, I was hooked. It turns out that's what they want me to think. And so there's books on doing remnant walls and trying to create a look of the past. And of course, rocks make a wonderful textural contrast to the plants themselves. So anyway, these are some use of rocks. I don't want to ignore plants altogether today, although it's a time when we don't have a lot of bloom. I am still concerned with the beauty of plants. For example, the shape of the plant I want to look at, because we do some pruning this time of year. And the spatial relationships between plants. I really don't want to overcrowd my plants. And of course, the last thing is the relationship between plants. Part of the beauty in the plants is having them surrounded by plants you're likely to see with them in nature. And sometimes not just putting in one plant into a plant community, but putting in a colony of plants. So this next photograph is of a shot from the manzanita chaparral that I have, with a little colony of knobcone pines growing through it. So anyway, I guess my main theme here today is is that the dry beauty at summer's end is about building on the naturalness, building as much beauty in the naturalness surrounding the plants as you can. And there's also other features. It's a time of migrating birds through the garden, and I just hope that these have given you some ideas to work with. Thank you.